let's start by stating the obvious, right? The opportunities are significant. Now, let's put a little bit of context around that before we take a deeper look at the challenges and the opportunities. Well, context number one is, in general, I think the energy transition in the region is a little bit in its nascency compared to other parts of the world. And therefore, you're likely going to get better impact for your buck in this part of the world than perhaps in others. That's one. And when we put some numbers around it, there's a bunch of these floating around. There's an estimate that the world in aggregate needs about $4 trillion in this journey, of which Asia needs 1.7. And I'd obsess less with those two numbers, but more with the fact that Asia makes up 40% of the global total, right? And I think that tells you something. That's one. The second is capital is going to come from governments, corporates, high net worth individuals, pension funds, professional investors, etc., etc. So there's going to be a massive flow of sustainable financing in this direction. And then the third thing is it's going to be used to develop infrastructure, to reframe corporate balance sheets, to build new supply chains, etc., 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 right? So there's going to be a lot of activity around this. Now, what I think therefore also that does is frame both the challenges and the opportunity side of the coin, because ultimately these are two sides of the same coin. Let's talk about challenges and specific to this region. Challenge number one is that incumbency of traditional forms of energy or fossil fuels that are in these societies, and these societies for vast majority are still grappling with the question of economic well-being versus transition. There's still an implicit trade-off envisioned there, and the tendency is still to go towards stuff that will impact the economic well-being singularly in these societies. And so the temptation therefore is to continue to invest in incumbent energy systems, which therefore means there is somewhat of a dearth of kind of bankable, sustainable financing targets and projects. That's one. The second is these sectors also do make up a big chunk of the economies in this part of the world, right? Oil and gas, metals and mining, the more traditional kind of thermal coal mining is still a big part of these economies. And so that is part of the challenge, is how do you migrate entire societies and economies in a way that kind of makes sense and is an orderly transition as opposed to flicking a switch. There's another example, palm oil, big part of this part of the world. It could play a big role in sustainable aviation fuel and biofuels, but there are certain concerns around that. So that becomes another challenge of how do you balance that. I think the third is, quite frankly, just the volume of capital that has to be deployed. And we've talked about this part of the world, again, generically being underdeveloped when it comes to infrastructure. And that's not something we've woken up to, right? Even in the old world, there has been that challenge for a number of decades. But if you now try and compress the level of change we need to do and the volume of capital that we need to direct into a much shorter time frame, which is what we need to do, that becomes the challenge. How do societies and governments and institutions build the muscle to deploy capital at that speed in an entirely new kind of set of areas rapidly? So for me, that frames the challenges. But before we obsess too much about that side, let's move to the kind of the more promising side, right? The opportunities. And I'd frame the opportunities again in two ways. One is the demand side, and one is the supply side, i.e. the supply of capital. On the demand side, look, these kinds of transformations happen literally. You can count it on one hand how many times they've happened in human history, kind of the industrial age and so on, and the ability to completely transform industries and societies. This is happening now, and this therefore gives these economies, these regions, an opportunity to leapfrog over a number of years, over a number of developmental iterations, and move much more quickly ahead. So that for me is a tremendous opportunity that lies ahead of us. The second opportunity is going back to the point of resources. There are some of these resources that are available here, and therefore it's not like an all game to a nothing game. There's very much opportunity that exists, whether it's nickel, whether it's biofuels, as I was talking about, for these regions to participate in that energy transition, and therefore the financing can find viable outlets too. And I think for me, the third opportunity is then also something I alluded to on the challenges side, which is entire new supply chains have to build. Circular economy, right? Waste. There's so much that gets generated in this part of the world. There's just a lot of, I guess, end product that we need to get our hands on to be able to force and enable transition for not just Asia, but for the larger part of the world. So that's for me is the demand side, right? And if I talk about the supply side, the supply of capital, again, there are three things that come to mind. One is, at least in my kind of professional lifetime, I have not seen such an absolute wall of capital from the developed world heading towards the developing world. It's just looking for outlets. I think investors, financiers have woken up to the fact that the opportunity is immense, and that if the transition were to happen for the planet as a whole, there has to be a lot of it will happen in this part of the world. So I think there is that opportunity, i.e. there is a lot of capital. And then let's move to the supply side of the opportunities, as I was saying, right? The supply of capital. Now, the first thing is, certainly in my professional career, I have not seen such an absolute wall of capital and commitments from the developed market waiting to make its way into the developing market, right? This certainly is unprecedented. So I think that creates opportunity. Number one is the capital is there. It's not being talked of in the hypothetical. I think the second opportunity is this, what I call regional champions, right? We had DBS a little while ago release an absolute marquee commitment into the market, saying this is the role they envision themselves playing in the energy transition, in the sustainable financing space. And I think that's going to be true not just of entities like DBS in the financial services sector, but likely of entities across different sectors. We are going to need these regional champions emerge, and I think that creates an opportunity, an economic opportunity for just differentiated competitive positioning for certain players. I think the third thing, while we're on this, is I suspect we'll see a lot of innovation on the financing side to make sure we meet the needs of these complicated markets in Asia that operate in the ways that are different from developed markets. So there's a lot of opportunity. I'm far more bullish than I am pessimistic, but I also recognize that there's just some wiring that needs to be put together to make sure that the opportunities that we talk about actually do overcome the challenges, and it's not the challenges that are the be all and end all. I think there is an absolute wall of supply of capital waiting, and I think there's real demand and real opportunity to deploy that capital. Where I think we need to be conscious is that wiring that connects that supply and demand, because it's going to come from a variety of sources. And I think the answer lies in all the actors, all the major groups of actors coming to the party, as it were. And who do I refer to in that context? Governments, regulators, corporates, and customers. And let me touch on each of them in order. From a government standpoint, governments do play a significant role in the economies in this part of the region. Again, in general terms, I think they will invariably have a role to play. And it's not just at the level of statements that lay out their energy portfolio as they envision it in 5, 10, 15 years' time, but actually putting some money behind that, whether that is in creative new public-private partnerships to ensure that certain assets and certain ventures that were otherwise considered unbankable now with government backing actually make it over the hurdle, whether it is in educating customers on why they should be making different choices, and indeed for where propositions do actually have to be quote unquote paid for by the customer, the government stepping in and using things at its disposal like tax breaks, incentives, and so on, to enable that transition so that investors actually see viability to their investments. For me, that's one. The second is regulators, right? And as the old adage goes, if you care about it, measure it. And I think one of the things we're struggling with in general is the ability to measure impact beyond simply carbon. There's a lot of thinking going on across industries on that, but I think regulators come to the party, as they have in other parts of the world, by forcing entities to measure and to report on the impact, report on what they're doing when it comes to the energy transition, to their sustainability efforts across ES and G. And I think that's going to need to happen in this part of the world as well, where regulators A, lay down standards, but B, kind of mandate the compliance with those standards across industries. The third bit, corporates, right? And again, I won't talk about corporates in general. I'll talk about this concept of regional champions and how we see, again, a once in a generation space for a whole bunch of entities across, and this is going to be universally true across sectors, to find new ways to express their competitive positioning in a way that talks about their business model, in a way that talks about how their balance sheets are structured, in a way that talks about how they connect with customers and what propositions they offer customers. And I think we are going to need to see innovation. We're going to have to see leaders, these regional champions emerge, not just because then they show the art of the possible, but because I think they'll create the slipstream for the next set of players in that industry to follow them, to follow that templatized approach, or close enough to that, to be able to drive larger change and therefore deploy more capital. And then finally, kind of all things start and end with the customer, right? And I think that we're going to have to see customers start to make different decisions so that investors can invest, so that governments are more bold and courageous in the change they need to make, so that regulators can back that all up with formalized regulatory frameworks, right? And to put it in context, we don't need to see a 5% change in 5% of the customer base. It would be much better if we saw even a 1% change in 50% of the customer base. In just in terms of thinking, in terms of how they opened their wallets, where they spent, what decisions they made. So for me, it's these four actors coming together, these four groups of actors coming together, that's going to unlock this opportunity that we've been talking about. Well, I guess before I start about what we are doing with our clients, let's just start about what we as an organization are doing. And as Marsh McLennan, which is the parent of Oliver Wyman, $20-odd billion company, we have laid out our net zero plan, right? Oliver Wyman is a carbon net neutral company as things stand. So we are doing some own introspection. We're trying to make sure we live by the values we expect our societies and our clients to live by. Now let's talk about the work that's out there in the public domain, right? And we're working with the major groups of actors I referenced. We're working with governments, with regulators, and clearly with corporates across the world. To give you an illustration, we have been part of the TCFD effort. We've been part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance and helping entities like this, and there's a whole longer list clearly of entities laying out the thinking of how should different groups of and organizations think about their transition, right, in a science-based approach as opposed to anything that isn't grounded necessarily in reality. And this is clearly focused on the banking space, on the financing space. You're already starting to see a lot of that come to life. Again, some of the commitments that TBS made when it did recently, a bunch of other banks in the region are making commitments in line with some of those publications, those thought pieces. Certainly, we are helping corporates across sectors. We're helping strategy teams, risk teams think about what does this mean, right? We're helping them think about where it is that they need to invest, where it is that they need to build resilience within their businesses, where it is that they need to start getting ahead of customers and training customers to look at the products and services that they buy in a different light, or indeed catch up with customers, for where customers are starting to get more demanding of the organizations that they engage with. So whether it's kind of core strategy or pivoting balance sheets or helping them risk manage, we cover that entire gamut of work. And I could go on and on. This is not just true of Asia. We are collaborating across regions to help transnational companies deal with this. We're dealing with kind of family-owned businesses, any number of kind of organizations. And certainly one leg of that is also helping governments. In a number of geographies, we're working with ministries as they think about how their sectors need to be transformed. So it's a long and varied list. I'm proud that we started with kind of an internal view and are now living those values and actually helping our societies and our industries transform.